Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Rus-Ukraine war. We start out here in the direction of Ivanivske, where the Russians have yet again managed to advance further. At the end of February, we saw them advance here to the east of the village. Yesterday, the Russian VDV soldiers managed to advance here in the southern parts, and today they've managed to advance in the northern parts. Fighting continues throughout the village, and with this we see that the Russian storming operations continue with the objective of capturing the village. With these daily advances, we see that the Russians are entering a new stage of the fighting in Novomykhailivka, where they have managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses here in the village and are likely going to advance further to the western parts as the fighting continues in this section of the front line, with the roads here to the north of Ivanivske. If the Russians manage to capture them and gain control of it, they could cut off the supplies to these fortifications here to the north and attack them from behind, allowing them to flank it from two directions, from the fortifications to the north and from Ivanivske to the south. But also advance further towards the forest lines and patches here to the west of Ivanivske, all the way through Jazov Yar. It's well connected. So with these developments, we see that the Russians are getting closer to flanking the Ukrainian positions and taking control over Ivanivske. Moving further south here in the direction of Avdiivka to the west of the city, the Ukrainians have launched a series of counterattacks over the past few days, and yesterday they managed to advance since yesterday to today in both the direction of Berdychi here to the north and in the direction of the Ninke to the south. We also see that the western parts of Avdiivka has returned to the gray zone. The Ukrainians here are launching a series of counterattacks constantly with armored vehicles and advanced elite units to try and recapture positions within these villages, and have so far succeeded twice, once in Tonenka and once in Berdychi. However, this does not come without a cost, as we see here in the direction of Berdychi. The Ukrainians in their counterattacks have lost another Abrams and another M1150. This brings the total losses of the Abrams to 2 and the total losses of the M1150 to 2. The M1150 is a Abrams chassis that is equipped with mine clearing equipment. So 2 mine clearing Abrams and 2 Abrams have been lost so far. We can confirm the loss of the second Abrams and the second M1150 with this footage here. First off, the Abrams tank we see with this footage here. The first picture shows a Ukrainian Abrams tank, and with the different objects, I've drawn lines around with the blue lines. These lines indicate different objects. At the very top, there's some green things on the earth. This is from a gate that was previously standing in previous footage. Then there are the 2 poles in the bottom right and right next to the Abrams. Then there's the vehicle right next to the Abrams. And if we take a look at this second picture here, this is a picture from the 47th Mechanized Brigade showing the footage of their ambush with the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle fighting against the Russian soldiers that were just dropped off in an ambush. We see the same vehicle, we see 2 poles at the right side and right next to the infantry fighting vehicle, and then we see some of these marks on the ground. So based on these 2 pictures, we see that this is the same location, and the Abrams was lost at the same place as the Bradley was fighting. Right next to the Bradley, we also see the green gates, similar to where the Abrams was ahead of. So with this, we see that the Abrams was lost in the same area as the Bradley was fighting, and that specific place is right here north of the cemetery in Berdychi. So this means the fighting was taking place here. This is why the advances by the Ukrainians in Berdychi has been in the western parts, and the Russians still hold positions in the eastern parts, because it was reported by Russian sources that this Abrams was destroyed by a RPG after it was abandoned by Ukrainian forces. That means Russian soldiers were located right next to the cemetery to shoot at it. As for the M1150, we see in this third picture here footage from afar. It later zooms in to the M1150 that is burning, and this is the smoke coming out from it. And with this footage, we see, based on the area, that the area right here in the central parts, this is the forest line, this is the cemetery area, and this is the area at which the M1150 is burning. As for the close-up of the M1150, we have that footage here, which shows the burning M1150 in the central parts of Berdychi. So with this, we have the geolocated confirmation of the Abrams and M1150, the second one of each type, destroyed or abandoned or damaged inside of the northern parts of Avdiivka. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians are definitely launching significant counterattacks with their armored vehicles, with their elite units, trying to recapture these villages. Yet the Russians are so far able to hold on and prevent the Ukrainians from recapturing them fully. But there's a lot of positional fighting, and the Ukrainians are making some advances here in this section of the front line. The area with the least success by the Ukrainians is in the direction of Berdychi, because the Russians managed to gain full control over the village before the Ukrainian counterattacks began. The Ukrainian counterattacks didn't start right ahead. At this very start, they were pulling back and withdrawing to better fortified positions. However, as soon as Syrsky arrived and fired some, let's say, disloyal commanders of these brigades, suddenly they started counterattacking at these positions with all of their might. The Russians are trying to hold on to their positions due to the sudden counterattacks, which took place practically out of nowhere based on how they were performing previously. This is likely why the Russians fell for the counterattack and ambush here with the Bradley in the central parts of Berdychi. The Russians were likely far beyond that point at the point, and they were likely just sending additional reinforcements to hold the village itself. But suddenly there was a Bradley there and a lot of artillery in an ambush. So the situation is likely that the Ukrainians counterattacked when the Russians didn't expect it due to their prior withdrawal, and this caught the Russians off guard, and have since then recollected their positions and are now counterattacking or regaining the initiative after Ukrainian counterattacks. Let's see what will happen over the next few days, as the Ukrainians will likely continue their counterattacks and the Russians will now put all of their efforts into holding these villages and then regain the initiative to then gain control over them. We then move on to the next section of the front line, which is here in the direction of Novomykhailivka, where yet again the Russians managed to advance within the town itself, and they've now gained control over the church in the center of the town. And with this, we see that the Russians are going to be advancing further in a western direction. With the control over the church, the fighting is now taking place in the central parts of the town, and the Russians are also fighting in the northern parts by the river line. With this, the Russians are looking to gain full control over it by capturing the central parts. This would allow the Russians to then expand their zone of control in the northern parts, allowing them for an additional supply route in and out of the town, with this road being connected to the northern parts, which the Ukrainians so far have been able to defend. However, if the Ukrainians lose the central parts of the town, the Russians would be able to flank their position, and as such, it is better for the Ukrainians to withdraw from these positions. Based on these developments, we can see that the most significant fighting that we have seen, likely since the Ukrainian summer offensive, where they were launching assaults en masse in the first weeks of the offensive, we have not seen something like this since then, where the Russians and the Ukrainians are sending their troops to face off head on with each other in the villages of Berdychi down to Tonenke, and in the southern parts by Novomykhailivka, the northern parts by Ivanivske, and down south to Robotyne. These villages see significant battles taking place, and a lot of the best equipment and best soldiers on both sides are fighting in these battles. This means that the outcome of these battles will have a significant effect on how these next few months will continue. If the Russians win these battles, then the Ukrainian forces will be in a very poor situation, where some of their most elite units have lost a battle. This would have a huge impact on the morale of the Ukrainians, and the Russians would likely take advantage of that and develop the situation further here to the west of Avdiivka towards better fortified Ukrainian positions, which are not properly finished yet. So if this battle drags on and it ends up in a stalemate, the Ukrainians would likely count that as a win, due to them gaining time to properly finish these fortifications west of Avdiivka. If the Russians manage to break through these Ukrainian counterattacks and regain the initiative, or even more significant, if they can make the 47th Mechanized Brigade and other of these brigades here in the section of the front line incapacitated and unable to perform combat positions and duties, therefore that would lead to a huge issue for the Ukrainians, because they would lose a significant part of their defensive tactics, which is the active defense part. This would allow the Russians to make significant breakthroughs throughout the front line. Small breakthroughs like Avdiivka would have a significant more impact and larger gains than what they currently have, with the Ukrainian forces moving around to counterattack. If they lose a significant portion of their elite units like the 47th Mechanized Brigade and a lot of the Abrams tanks, they would be in a very poor position moving forward. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.